As the Second World War began, the Americans introduced the first semi-automatic rifle ever issued in combat, which was the M1 Garand. This gun would completely change how wars were fought from then on. However, the people who had to use them rarely survived despite its excellence. So today we're going to explain the absolute hell American marksmen had to go through. Okay, so the story actually starts with one of the darkest moments in American history. In the late 1930s, the Garand slowly replaced the old bolt-action Springfield rifle in American armories, but by the time Pearl Harbor was hit on December 7th, 1941, only about half of US ground forces had actually been issued the new rifle. So when Japanese troops came pouring ashore in the Philippines just days later, the men holding those islands were a mix of American troops and Filipino scouts who history would come to call the battling bastards of Bataan. About half of them carried the brand new Garand, while the rest still gripped old M1903 Springfield bolt actions left over from the First World War. A sergeant of the 26th Cavalry Philippine Scouts named Dan Figuration is recorded by his unit as one of the first Americans to fire an M1 in real combat, somewhere along the shores of Lingayen Gulf, and the Japanese were absolutely not ready for what was coming at them. A single GI with a Garand could put 8 aimed rounds downrange in the time a Japanese rifleman with his bolt action Arisaka fired 2 of his own. So entire enemy assault waves came apart against that wall of fire, and Japanese officers reported back that the Americans were using machine guns when they were really just using rifles. But the men in those foxholes were about to run into a problem nobody back home had even thought of. You see, the Garand and the Springfield used totally different ammo clips, even though they fired the exact same 30-06 round. The Springfield took a 5-round stripper clip you fed in by hand, while the Garand used an 8-round and block clip that locked into the rifle itself, and that was the only way to load it. But the supply officers behind the lines did not seem to grasp the difference, so trucks would roll up loaded with stripper clips that were completely useless to the Garand riflemen. These men had to crawl out of their foxholes, scrounge their own ejected and block clips out of the residue, and hand load them round by round while Japanese soldiers kept coming. And it quickly started getting a lot worse than that. By April 9th, 1942, the battling bastards had run out of food, ammunition, and any hope of reinforcements arriving. When the order to surrender finally came down, the men holding M1s smashed their rifles against rocks and trees so the Japanese could not capture them in working condition. A few months later, those same men were either dead or being marched up the peninsula in what we now call the Bataan Death March, where roughly 75,000 American and Filipino prisoners walked 65 miles in tropical heat without food or water. So the rifle that had just earned its first day of combat was now mostly in Japanese hands, and the men who had carried it were lying in the dirt beside the road. By the summer of 1944, that grim opening chapter had completely flipped on its head. Millions of Garands were now in the hands of troops pushing across France after D-Day, and the rifle was earning a reputation that scared the absolute hell out of German infantry. In January 1945, General George Patton sat down and wrote a letter calling the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised, and that quote stuck for the next 80 years. But there was one place in Europe where even Patton's greatest battle implement could not save the men carrying it. That was a 50 square mile patch of pine forest sitting on the German border called the Hurtgen, and the US First Army was about to walk straight into it. The fight ran from September 1944 all the way into February 1945, making it the longest single battle the US Army has ever fought, and it cost roughly 33,000 American casualties. The troops who lived through it gave the place a name that stuck for life, calling it the Death Factory. The Germans had figured out that artillery shells fused to burst in the treetops sent down a rain of jagged wood splinters mixed with red-hot shrapnel. So a man could be flat on his belly inside a foxhole and still get killed by something coming straight down at him. By December 16th, 1944, Hitler had one last gamble left in him, and he played it through the snow-covered Ardennes forest just south of where Hurtgen had ended. The Americans called it the Battle of the Bulge, and it became one of the costliest battles in US Army history, with roughly 80,000 American casualties in just over a month. And here is where the Garand met an enemy it really could not fight. The Ardennes, that winter dropped well below zero, and that kind of cold turns precision machinery into pure dead weight. The grease packed inside the Garand froze solid, locking the bolt completely in place, so a marksman could pull the trigger and get nothing but a dull click. And the things these men did to keep their rifles alive sound like something out of the Dark Ages. A lot of soldiers cycled the bolt by hand every couple of minutes just to crack the ice forming inside the action. Others slept curled around the rifle inside their coats, sharing whatever body heat they had with the cold steel. steel. And in the most desperate moments, men actually urinated on the bolt to thaw out the grease, which worked exactly once, but ruined the rifle for good afterwards. Photographs from this period show men like Private First Class Frank Vukasin of the 331st Infantry Regiment reloading his Garand outside Houffalize, Belgium. On the other side of the world, the Garand was fighting a totally different kind of war in jungles, so thick you could not see a man 5 yards in front of you. A smaller weapon like the M1 carbine simply did not have the punch to push a bullet through bamboo, palm wood, and a Japanese soldier in one go. So Marines across the Pacific sneakily started swapping their lighter carbines for full-size Garands chambered in the heavy 30-aught 6-round, because in those islands you needed a rifle that could blast through a tree trunk first and find its target on the other side. And then came Okinawa, which was a horror show on a level of its own. By April of 1945, the Americans were knocking on Japan's front door, and Okinawa was the last big island before the home islands themselves. So the Japanese had decided to make every yard of it cost American lives, with terrain made of steep ridges, deep cave networks, and sugarcane fields all soaked under almost 2 months of unending rain. The whole island turned into a swamp of grey residue, and Japanese soldiers hid in those caves during the day and crept out at night to ambush American positions. So a Garand marksman holding a hill on Okinawa was firing blind through driving rain at shapes moving in the dark. You see, the Japanese infantry Arisaka rifle was far too slow in these conditions. So when Japanese officers ordered a banzai charge across open ground, what they were really doing was sending packed waves of men straight into a wall of semi-auto fire, while they only had old World War I rifles. A captured Japanese report from the Pacific noted that American divisions had roughly 5 to 6 times the firepower of their own, and Okinawa was where that gap finally caught up with the defenders. A single American squad dug in on a ridge could put down enough rounds to break a Japanese company before they ever got within bayonet range, but the men on the receiving end of all that firepower were paying a brutal price of their own. The 82-day battle for Okinawa cost the Americans roughly 12,500 dead and over 49,000 total casualties, making it the bloodiest fight of the entire Pacific War. The rain that May dumped almost a foot of residue across the island in just a few weeks, so Garands started rusting up fast enough that men were stripping them down twice a day just to keep them firing. The heat in the ravines was brutal enough on its own, and a marksman lugging a 9.5-pound rifle up a slope of slick grey muck would be soaked through with sweat before he even saw a target. And here is where the most famous story about the Garand actually comes into play. You see, when the last round was fired from a Garand, the empty 8-round clip would pop out of the rifle with a loud metallic ping. For decades, the legend has been that Japanese soldiers would listen for that ping in the dark and rush the American before he could reload. Well, the truth turns out to be more complicated than the legend. Most modern historians say the ping would be drowned out by the noise of any real firefight. Now, the Garand also had one rather infamous flaw in its design, which literally left American soldiers with a broken thumb. It came from the rifle itself, and it gave nearly every American infantryman the same painful injury at some point in his service. The marksman had a name for it that became almost a rite of passage in basic training. You see, to load a fresh clip into the Garand, the soldier had to push down on the top round of the en-bloc clip with his thumb, and then snap his hand out of the way before the bolt slammed forward. But the bolt was driven by a heavy spring, and it crashed home with the force of a hammer hitting an anvil. If your thumb was even a fraction of a second too slow, the bolt would catch it and crush it between 2 pieces of solid steel. The result was a black, swollen thumb that looked like it had been smashed with a brick. A few men got off easy with just bruising, but plenty ended up with cracked thumbnails, deep cuts, and even broken bones in their hand. And here is where it actually became a real combat problem for these blokes. A man with a smashed thumb couldn't grip a rifle properly anymore or reload fast under fire, so most of these soldiers became a huge liability to the rest of his squad. So drill sergeants pounded the loading procedure into recruits over and over until the muscle memory was completely automatic. By the time the Second World War actually ended, even the men who loved the Garand knew the rifle had real problems to fix. The biggest one was that 8-round en bloc clip we have been talking about all video. So the moment the war was over, John Garand himself went back to Springfield Armory in Massachusetts and started working on an upgrade called the T-20. The T-20 had a 20-round detachable magazine and could fire on full auto, but the war ended before it could go into mass production, and the project was shelved for almost 10 years, but it would later completely change modern warfare. In 1957, the US Army officially picked a rifle called the T-44 and renamed it the M14. The M14 was basically a Garand with all the upgrades the men had been begging for, using a 20-round detachable magazine and the new 7.62 by 51mm NATO round instead of the older 30-06, about 1.38 million. M14s were built between 1959 and 1964. But here is the part nobody at Springfield ever expected. The M14 went to Vietnam in the early 1960s, and it ran straight into the same kind of jungle that had tested the Garand on Okinawa 15 years earlier. The woodstock swelled in the wet air and made it generally inaccurate, and the 7.62 round kicked so hard on full auto that men called it an anti-aircraft gun because the barrel climbed straight up into the trees after the first round. So by 1967, the M14 was being phased out for the lighter M16, and it served as the standard US battle rifle for only about 11 years.